There's a question that sounds almost childish until you actually sit with it. What could possibly eat a great white shark? Not scavenge one. Not wound one in a territorial scrap. Swallow it, whole, and then vanish back into the ocean as if nothing had happened. For a long time, that question had no serious answer, because the great white sits at the very top of the marine food chain. It has no natural predator. That is, until a small tracking device washed up on an Australian beach and forced marine scientists to rewrite what they thought they knew. This is the story of that device, the shark it was attached to, and the unsettling process of elimination that followed. A process that ended with researchers accepting an answer most of them didn't want to believe. Off the southwestern coast of Australia, in the early 2000s, a team of marine biologists was running one of the first serious satellite tagging programs aimed at understanding how great white sharks move through open water. Great whites are notoriously hard to study. They range across enormous distances, dive to depths no diver or submersible casually visits, and spend most of their lives far from the eyes of any research vessel. A tag was the only realistic way to follow one once it swam out of sight. The tool of choice was a pop-up satellite archival tag, a compact instrument that clips onto a shark's dorsal fin and quietly records data for months. Depth, water temperature, ambient light levels, time of day. It does not transmit in real time. Instead, on a pre-programmed date, it releases itself, floats to the surface, and beams its stored data up to a satellite. Only later, once the tag is recovered or its data downloaded, do researchers get to reconstruct where the animal actually went. The shark selected for this particular tag was a mature female, roughly 9 feet long and weighing in the neighborhood of 500 pounds, a fully grown, healthy adult in the prime of her life. Exactly the kind of specimen researchers hoped would yield months of clean migratory data. The tag was fitted, the shark released, and the boat moved on to the next candidate. For 4 months, nothing more was heard from her. Tags are built to be recovered eventually, either by transmitting their archive via satellite or by physically washing ashore if the antenna malfunctions. In this case, the device turned up on a beach a couple of miles from where it had been deployed, intact, functional, and full of months of stored readings. The shark itself was never seen again. At first, nobody in the lab expected anything dramatic. Recovered tags usually tell a fairly mundane story. A shark cruising the continental shelf, diving here and there to hunt, drifting through predictable temperature bands as it moves between deep and shallow water. Great whites are coastal and open ocean generalists, but their day-to-day behavior tends to be repetitive once you've seen enough of it. This tag didn't tell a mundane story. The depth log showed something abrupt. Rather than the gradual exploratory diving pattern typical of a hunting shark, the readings showed an almost vertical plunge, a rapid descent to nearly 1,900 feet in the span of a few minutes. That alone was strange. Great white sharks spend the overwhelming majority of their time within the top few hundred feet of the water column, where sunlight penetrates and prey is abundant. A sudden drop that deep, that fast, is not typical foraging behavior. It looks far more like something being taken somewhere against its will. Strange as that was, it was the temperature data that turned confusion into alarm. At nearly 1,900 feet in that part of the Southern Ocean, water temperatures hover a little above freezing, cold enough that almost nothing warm-blooded chooses to linger there for long. If the tag had simply detached and sunk on its own, or if the shark had died and drifted to the bottom, the expected reading at that depth would track the surrounding seawater, cold, and getting colder with depth. Instead, right around the moment of that rapid plunge, the recorded temperature spiked, climbing from the mid-40s Fahrenheit up to a stable reading in the high 70s. And it didn't flicker briefly before settling back down, the way a failing sensor sometimes does. It held there steady for an extended period, nearly 1,900 feet beneath the surface, in water that should have been near freezing. There's really only one physical explanation for a warm, stable reading like that in near-freezing deep water. The sensor was no longer in the ocean. It was inside something warm-bodied, something alive, something with an interior far removed from the cold of the surrounding sea. In other words, the tag, and the shark wearing it, had been swallowed. Once the research team accepted that conclusion, the obvious next question was, swallowed by what? A 9-foot, 500-pound great white shark is not an easy meal for anything. Whatever did this had to be large enough to take an adult apex predator whole, capable of diving to nearly 1,900 feet, and warm enough on the inside to produce that temperature spike. That's a very short list of candidates, and each one falls apart under scrutiny. Killer whales were an obvious first thought. Orcas are known to prey on great whites. There are documented cases, particularly off South Africa, of orcas flipping sharks upside down to induce a paralytic state called tonic immobility before feeding, often targeting the liver specifically. It's a genuinely effective and well-observed hunting technique. But orcas are not deep divers. Their typical dives rarely exceed a few hundred feet, and even their most extreme recorded dives fall well short of 1,900 feet. An orca dragging prey down to nearly 2/5 of a mile and lingering there simply doesn't match how the species behaves. Sperm whales solve the depth problem instantly. They are among the deepest diving mammals on Earth, regularly hunting squid thousands of feet down. Their throats are more than large enough to accommodate a shark that size. But sperm whales run a body temperature close to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, nowhere near the roughly 78-degree reading captured on the tag. They're also squid specialists. A 9-foot shark isn't part of their normal diet. Right depth, wrong everything else. Other large sharks, tiger sharks, oceanic whitetips, were considered too. Tiger sharks in particular are famous for swallowing almost anything. But the largest confirmed individuals top out around 14 feet. To take a 9-foot shark down whole, a predator generally needs to be roughly double the length of its prey, not just modestly larger. The math doesn't work. Even a giant squid was floated as a possibility, since something that size could theoretically be large enough. But squid are cold-blooded invertebrates. Their internal temperature simply mirrors the surrounding seawater. There's no mechanism for a squid to produce a sustained 78-degree reading in near-freezing water. That idea didn't survive long. One by one, every conventional predator either had the wrong depth range, the wrong body temperature, or was simply too small. The list of things capable of eating an adult great white shark whole was narrowing toward something researchers hadn't seriously considered. The candidate that finally fit every piece of the puzzle was, in a strange way, the least exotic option available. Another great white shark. Not a slightly larger rival in a brief scuffle, but an individual large enough that a 9-foot, 500-pound adult was, to it, simply prey. The key to understanding why the temperature reading fits comes down to a genuine biological quirk of the species. Most sharks are ectothermic, cold-blooded, matching the water around them. Great whites are a partial exception. They belong to a family of sharks capable of regional endothermy, meaning they use dense networks of blood vessels to retain metabolic heat generated by their swimming muscles, keeping their core, stomach, eyes, and brain measurably warmer than the surrounding ocean. It's part of what allows them to hunt effectively even in cold water. A typical adult great white might run a stomach temperature somewhere in the mid to high 60s Fahrenheit, warmer than the sea, but nowhere near 78 degrees. Scale the animal up dramatically, though, and the physics change. More muscle mass generates more metabolic heat, and a larger body retains that heat far more efficiently against a cold environment. In the gut of a truly massive great white, one considerably larger than the 9-footer that was tagged, a sustained internal temperature in the high 70s becomes entirely plausible. The depth checks out too, once you set aside the assumption that great whites are strictly shallow water animals. Tagging studies elsewhere have recorded great whites diving beyond 3,000 feet in open water. A dive to 1,900 feet is extreme, but it's well within the demonstrated range of the species. So how large would a great white need to be to swallow a 9-foot individual whole? Researchers who study shark predation generally estimate that a predator needs to be roughly twice the length of prey it intends to consume whole. Applied here, that points to an animal in the range of 16 feet and well over 2 tons, a shark sitting at or slightly beyond the upper limit of what's typically documented for the species. It's worth pausing on why an animal that large could exist and essentially never appear in the scientific record. The ocean is vast almost beyond intuition. The Pacific alone covers roughly 60 million square miles, and the combined oceans surpass 100 million. The portion of that space researchers have meaningfully studied, particularly anything below 1,000 feet, is a small fraction of the whole. Great white populations are also small and unevenly sampled. Global estimates put the species in the low thousands of individuals, and only a modest number have ever been successfully tagged. There's a built-in bias, too. Research tagging tends to happen where sharks come close to shore, which skews toward younger, smaller individuals. The largest, oldest females, the ones most likely to reach exceptional size, tend to range through deep, open water far from coastlines, boats, and cages. It's a bit like trying to characterize the size range of elephants by only ever observing the calves that wander near a fence line. This isn't purely theoretical. Deep Blue, one of the largest great whites ever reliably filmed, was documented off Guadalupe Island in 2013. A female estimated at roughly 20 feet and around 4,500 pounds, thought to be several decades old. There's no evidence connecting Deep Blue to this particular case. They were observed in entirely different oceans, and no link has ever been established between them. She's mentioned here only to illustrate a simple point. Sharks of that scale are not hypothetical. They exist, they've been photographed, and by definition, an unknown number of similarly sized or larger individuals have never been. Once researchers accepted what the tag was telling them, they went looking for corroborating evidence, and it turned out to already exist, scattered across decades of shark research that nobody had assembled into a single picture. Great white cannibalism is a documented, if under-discussed, phenomenon. It begins before birth. Developing embryos in the womb consume unhatched siblings, a reproductive strategy well established in shark biology, and sometimes called intrauterine cannibalism. At feeding aggregations, larger individuals are known to dominate and displace smaller ones, and juveniles genuinely face risk from adults sharing the same waters. Researchers have recovered the bodies of dead great whites bearing bite wounds, whose spacing, arc, and serration pattern match no animal other than another great white. Divers and field researchers have also photographed living sharks carrying long-healed scars consistent with an attack from one of their own, survivors of encounters nobody witnessed. The pattern extends beyond the species itself. In a separate case, researchers tracking a pregnant porbeagle shark, a smaller relative of the great white, recovered tag data indicating the animal had been attacked and very likely consumed by a larger predator, with a great white considered a leading candidate. It was described at the time as the first documented case of porbeagle predation recorded anywhere. Individually, each of these data points can be explained away as an isolated territorial dispute or a squabble over a carcass. Scientists are right to be cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from a handful of incidents. But laid end to end across decades and across oceans, and combined with a case as direct as the tagged shark's plunge and temperature spike, the picture that emerges is harder to dismiss. The largest great whites don't just compete with smaller members of their species. On occasion, they eat them. The implications reach further than one dramatic case study. Great white sharks are commonly treated as the reference point for apex predator, the animal everything else in coastal marine ecosystems organizes its behavior around, and which itself answers to nothing. If the largest individuals of the species prey on smaller members of their own kind, then the apex isn't a fixed ceiling. It's a moving target that depends on relative size, and our working model of the food chain may need an asterisk we hadn't previously considered. That matters practically, not just conceptually. Conservation strategies for great whites rely on population models that generally treat fishing pressure, bycatch, and habitat loss as the primary threats. Predation from larger members of their own species isn't a variable those models typically account for. If it's a meaningful factor, even a modest one, then population estimates and recovery projections built without it could be missing a piece of the picture. It also raises a broader question that's harder to answer comfortably. How many other species we casually label as apex predators are, in specific circumstances, prey to larger, rarer members of their own kind, individuals we've simply never tagged, filmed, or documented, because they live in parts of the ocean we rarely visit. Based on everything this case revealed, The honest answer is that nobody currently knows. Perhaps the strangest detail in the entire case is that the animal responsible for it all was never identified. No photograph exists of her. No tag was ever attached. The only reason anyone knows she was there is a small plastic device that happened to survive the encounter and drift onto a beach 4 months later, carrying a record of a meal no human witnessed. She isn't a monster from folklore. Based on everything the data indicates, she was almost certainly just a great white shark, an unusually large, mature individual doing exactly what her species has quietly done for millions of years, at a scale most of us never imagined it could occur. That, in its own way, is more unsettling than any sea monster story could be. We tend to think of the ocean as thoroughly mapped and categorized, its major predators known and ranked. But new large marine species are still being formally described well into the modern era, and cases like this one are a reminder that even our best studied, most iconic predator still has room in its story for something we hadn't accounted for. Somewhere off the southwestern coast of Australia, or in waters like it around the world, animals like her are likely still out there. Rarely seen, rarely tagged, moving through the deep water far from research boats and dive cages, doing exactly what apex predators have always done. We simply haven't been looking in the right part of the ocean to notice.